The morning fog clung to the glass towers of downtown Chicago like a gray shroud, muffling the symphony of car horns and construction noise that normally filled the concrete canyons. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez sat on a weathered bench outside the Cook County Courthouse, his calloused hands trembling as he clutched a manila envelope containing documents that would determine his future. The sharp October wind carried the scent of roasted coffee from a nearby cart and the acrid smell of diesel exhaust from buses rumbling past. Marcus inhaled deeply, trying to steady his nerves. The courthouse loomed before him, its limestone facade streaked with decades of Chicago rain, massive columns supporting a structure that had witnessed countless human dramas unfold within its walls. At 34, Marcus bore the invisible scars of 3 tours in Afghanistan. His once pristine army uniform had been replaced by a borrowed suit that hung loosely on his lean frame, a testament to the 20 pounds he'd lost since returning home 18 months ago. The nightmares had stolen his appetite, just as they'd stolen his peace. "You can do this, brother," he whispered to himself, repeating the words his VA counselor had taught him. But the familiar knot in his stomach tightened as he remembered why he was here. The charges were simple on paper: disturbing the peace, public intoxication. The reality was more complex. 3 weeks ago, Marcus had been walking past Millennium Park when the sound of a backfiring motorcycle triggered a flashback so severe he dove behind a fountain, screaming warnings about incoming mortars. Concerned citizens called 911, and by the time the police arrived, Marcus was soaked, shaking, and unable to explain what century he was living in. The arresting officer, a young patrolman named Davidson, had been surprisingly gentle. "My dad served in Vietnam," he'd said quietly as he helped Marcus to his feet. "Let's get you somewhere safe." But the system was less understanding than Officer Davidson. The district attorney wanted to make an example, claiming that veterans couldn't use PTSD as an excuse for public disruption. Marcus stood and smoothed his jacket, feeling the weight of his service medals in his breast pocket. His lawyer, a overworked public defender named Sarah Chen, had warned him that Judge Patricia Holloway was known for her tough love approach to veteran cases. "She thinks military service should make you stronger, not weaker," Sarah had explained during their brief consultation. "Just answer her questions directly and try not to show emotion." The courthouse steps were crowded with people clutching legal documents, their faces wearing expressions Marcus recognized from his own mirror, a mixture of hope and dread. A group of law students in wrinkled suits huddled near the entrance, discussing cases with the intensity of generals planning a campaign. Marcus envied their confidence. Inside, the courthouse smelled of industrial disinfectant and decades of human anxiety. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made everyone look like suspects. Marcus found Courtroom 3B and took a seat in the back, watching as other cases were called. A woman fighting an eviction clutched her children close. An elderly man pleaded for more time to pay his medical bills. Each story was a variation on the same theme: people trying to hold their lives together in a system that seemed designed to break them apart. "Rodriguez, Marcus!" the bailiff called. Marcus's legs felt like concrete as he walked to the defendant's table. Sarah Chen appeared beside him, her expression professional but kind. "Remember," she whispered, "just tell the truth." Judge Holloway entered the courtroom like a force of nature. At 62, she commanded attention with her silver hair pulled back severely and dark eyes that seemed to catalog every weakness. Her black robes rustled as she took her seat behind the bench, elevated above the rest of them like a dark angel of judgment. "The people versus Marcus Rodriguez," she announced, her voice echoing off the oak-paneled walls. "Charges of disturbing the peace and public intoxication." Marcus stood at attention, muscle memory from years of military service overriding his fear. In that moment, he was transported back to countless formations, standing proud in desert camouflage under the Afghan sun, surrounded by brothers who understood the weight of duty and sacrifice. Judge Holloway's courtroom was a theater of human frailty, and she had grown tired of the performance. For 15 years, she had presided over cases that ranged from petty theft to domestic violence, watching as defendants paraded their sob stories before her bench like actors auditioning for sympathy. Today's case seemed no different. "Mr. Rodriguez," she began, not bothering to look up from the file, "it says here you served 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "And you've been back for 18 months?" "Yes, ma'am." Judge Holloway finally raised her eyes, studying Marcus with the cold efficiency of a scientist examining a specimen. The courtroom's ventilation system hummed overhead, circulating stale air that carried the mingled scents of fear, cheap cologne, and the cleaning solution used to mop the floors each night. "So you've had plenty of time to adjust to civilian life," she continued, making notes on a yellow legal pad. "Yet 3 weeks ago, you chose to create a disturbance in one of our city's most prominent public spaces. Can you explain this behavior?" Sarah Chen rose from her chair. "Your Honor, my client suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition directly related to his military service. The incident was triggered by—" "I didn't ask you, Counselor," Judge Holloway cut her off with surgical precision. "I asked Mr. Rodriguez." She turned back to Marcus, her expression hardening. "Well, are you going to hide behind your lawyer, or are you going to take responsibility for your actions?" Marcus felt the familiar pressure building behind his eyes, the weight of memories threatening to crash over him like a tsunami. He could hear the distant sound of helicopters. No, it was just the air conditioning system, but his brain couldn't tell the difference. The fluorescent lights above seemed to strobe like muzzle flashes in the darkness. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice cracking, "I was walking past the park when I heard a loud noise. It sounded like incoming fire. I know it wasn't rational, but in that moment I was back in Kandahar. I was trying to protect people." A tear rolled down his cheek, and he quickly wiped it away, embarrassed by the display of emotion in this sterile temple of justice. Judge Holloway leaned forward, her voice dripping with disdain. "Mr. Rodriguez, are you seriously going to stand in my courtroom and cry? You're a grown man, a soldier. Act like one." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Around him, the courtroom seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as his breathing became shallow and rapid. He could feel the eyes of everyone present, the bailiff, the court reporter, the handful of spectators, all of them witnessing his humiliation. "Your Honor," Sarah Chen interjected, rising again, "my client is clearly suffering from—" "What he's suffering from," Judge Holloway interrupted, her voice rising to fill the courtroom, "is an inability to accept responsibility for his actions. I'm tired of veterans coming into my courtroom thinking their service gives them a free pass to disrupt society. You want to cry? Cry at home. You want to have flashbacks? Get therapy. But don't expect the taxpayers of Chicago to subsidize your self-pity." Marcus felt his knees buckle slightly. The metals in his pocket suddenly felt like lead weights, pulling him down into an abyss of shame. He thought of his squad leader, Sergeant First Class Williams, who had died saving a group of Afghan children from an IED. Williams had never made it home to face judgment from civilians who couldn't understand the cost of their freedom. The courtroom's double doors at the back suddenly swung open with a bang that echoed like a gunshot. Every head turned as heavy footsteps echoed across the marble floor. General Patricia Morrison had been sitting in her staff car outside the courthouse for 20 minutes debating whether to go inside. At 58, she commanded the respect of subordinates and superiors alike through 3 decades of distinguished service, including 2 tours as a field commander in Iraq and Afghanistan. Her silver hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her dress blue uniform bore the ribbons of a warrior who had earned her stars through courage, not politics. She had been in Chicago for a Pentagon briefing when her aide mentioned seeing a news item about a veteran being prosecuted for a PTSD episode. Something about the case had gnawed at her throughout the morning meeting, a familiar feeling she'd learned not to ignore during her years of command. Now, stepping into Judge Holloway's courtroom, General Morrison surveyed the scene with the tactical awareness that had kept her alive in combat zones. She saw Marcus Rodriguez standing at attention despite his obvious distress, his public defender looking overwhelmed, and a judge whose body language radiated contempt rather than justice. "Excuse me," General Morrison said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Your Honor, I apologize for interrupting your proceedings." Judge Holloway's mouth fell open slightly as she took in the 4 stars on the general's collar. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The only sound the quiet hum of the ventilation system and the distant rumble of traffic outside. "General," Judge Holloway began, clearly flustered. "Morrison," the general supplied, moving with measured steps toward the bench. "Patricia Morrison, United States Army. I understand you have a veteran before you today?" Marcus turned, his eyes widening as he recognized the rank insignia. A 4-star general was a creature of legend in the enlisted ranks, someone you might glimpse from a distance during ceremonies, but never expected to meet face to face. Your Honor, General Morrison continued, I couldn't help but overhear your comments about Sergeant Rodriguez. May I ask if you've ever served in combat? Judge Holloway's face flushed red. I don't see how that's relevant to— It's entirely relevant, the general interrupted, her voice remaining calm but carrying an edge that could cut steel. Because if you had served, you would understand that what you're witnessing isn't weakness. It's the cost of freedom. The general turned to address the entire courtroom, her voice carrying to every corner. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez served 3 tours in Afghanistan. He volunteered to deploy when others found excuses to stay home. He risked his life daily so that you could sleep safely in your beds, so that your children could play in parks without fear of suicide bombers. Marcus felt his spine straighten instinctively as the general spoke. For the first time in months, he felt the pride of his service beginning to override the shame of his struggles. The incident you're prosecuting, General Morrison continued, was not a crime. It was a wound earned in service to his country. When Sergeant Rodriguez heard that backfiring motorcycle, his brain didn't distinguish it from the mortars that killed his friends. His body reacted the way we trained it to react, with vigilance, with the instinct to protect others, even at his own expense. Judge Holloway had gone pale, her earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. The courtroom was silent, except for the scratch of the court reporter's fingers flying across her stenotype machine. General Morrison, she began weakly, You were merely trying to shame a war hero for being human, the general cut her off. Let me tell you something about Staff Sergeant Rodriguez that isn't in your file. His squad was responsible for establishing security in a village outside Kandahar. They built relationships with the local children, distributed medical supplies, and provided the stability that allowed a girls' school to operate for the first time in decades. The general's voice grew quieter, more intimate, drawing everyone in the courtroom closer. One day, intelligence indicated a suicide bomber was targeting that school. Sergeant Rodriguez and his team could have called in an airstrike, but that would have destroyed the building and killed innocent people. Instead, they went in on foot. Marcus closed his eyes, the memory flooding back with crystal clarity. The smell of diesel fuel and cooking spices in the narrow alleyways. The sound of children's laughter echoing off mud brick walls, the weight of his rifle and the terrible certainty that some of them might not make it home. They found the bomber, General Morrison continued. A 14-year-old boy strapped with explosives, terrified and crying. The easy solution would have been to shoot him. Instead, Sergeant Rodriguez spent 45 minutes talking to that child in broken Pashto, convincing him that there was another way. They saved the school, they saved the children, and they saved that boy. Tears were flowing freely down Marcus's face now, but he made no attempt to hide them. These were different tears, not tears of shame, but of remembrance and honor for the brothers he'd served with. Your Honor, the general said, turning back to Judge Holloway, when warriors like Sergeant Rodriguez come home, they deserve our gratitude, not our judgment. They deserve our support, not our scorn. The fact that he broke down in a public park isn't a crime. It's a reminder of what he sacrificed for all of us. The silence in the courtroom stretched for what felt like an eternity, heavy with the weight of truth and the shifting of perspectives. Judge Holloway stared down at her legal pad, the notes she had been making suddenly seeming petty and irrelevant. The fluorescent lights continued their quiet hum, but the atmosphere in the room had transformed completely. Marcus wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, no longer caring who saw his tears. Standing in that courtroom, listening to General Morrison speak about his service with such dignity and understanding, he felt something he hadn't experienced since coming home. Recognition. Not pity, not fear, but acknowledgement of what he and his brothers-in-arms had endured and accomplished. Judge Holloway finally looked up, her earlier composure completely gone. The harsh lines around her eyes had softened, and when she spoke, her voice carried none of its previous authority. General Morrison, she said quietly, I owe you an apology, and I owe Sergeant Rodriguez an even greater one. She turned to Marcus, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Sergeant, I spoke out of ignorance, and there's no excuse for that. I was wrong to diminish your service or your sacrifice. Marcus straightened even further, the military bearing that had been drilled into him over years of service asserting itself naturally. Thank you, Your Honor, he said simply. The charges against Sergeant Rodriguez are hereby dismissed, Judge Holloway announced, banging her gavel once with finality. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, but this time Marcus didn't flinch. This time, it was the sound of justice being served. The courtroom erupted in quiet murmurs as spectators processed what they had witnessed. Sarah Chen placed a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder, her relief evident. "You're free to go," she whispered. General Morrison approached the defendant's table, extending her hand to Marcus. When he shook it, her grip was firm and warm, the handshake of one warrior acknowledging another. "Sergeant Rodriguez," she said, "walk with me." They moved together toward the courthouse exit, their footsteps echoing in the marble hallway. Outside, the October sun had burned through the morning fog, bathing the city in golden light. The sounds of Chicago, the traffic, the construction, the distant murmur of millions of people going about their daily lives, no longer seemed threatening to Marcus. They were the sounds of the civilization he had helped protect. "How did you know?" Marcus asked as they paused on the courthouse steps. "How did you know about Kandahar?" General Morrison smiled, the expression transforming her stern features. "Because I make it my business to know about soldiers like you. Heroes don't always get the recognition they deserve, but they should never be forgotten." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a business card. "I want you to contact my office. We have programs, real programs, that can help you transition back to civilian life. You've given enough to your country. Now let your country give something back to you." Marcus took the card, feeling its weight despite being just a piece of paper. It represented something he had almost lost faith in: hope. "There's something else," the general continued. "That girls' school in Kandahar. It's still operating. Enrollment has tripled since you were there. The village elder sent a letter through military channels specifically asking about the American soldiers who saved their children. They call you heroes." The words hit Marcus like a physical force, but this time it was a good blow, the impact of purpose rediscovered. For months he had questioned whether his service had mattered, whether the sacrifices of his friends had meant anything. Now he knew. As General Morrison walked toward her waiting staff car, Marcus remained on the courthouse steps, watching the flow of people around him. Each person had their own story, their own struggles, their own battles to fight. But for the first time since coming home, Marcus felt equipped to face his own battle with the demons that haunted his sleep. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number for his VA counselor, Dr. Sarah Hoffman. When she answered, he could hear the surprise in her voice. "Marcus, how did the hearing go?" "Better than expected," he said, surprising himself with the strength in his own voice. "Dr. Hoffman, I think I'm ready to start those group sessions you mentioned. I want to get better. I want to help other veterans get better too." That evening, Marcus sat in his small apartment overlooking the Chicago River, watching the sun set over the city skyline. The familiar sounds of traffic and urban life drifted through his window, but they no longer made him tense with anticipation of danger. Instead, they reminded him that he was home, that he was safe, and that he had played a part in making this peaceful moment possible. On his coffee table lay General Morrison's business card next to a photo of his squad taken during their second tour. The faces of his fallen brothers smiled back at him, frozen in a moment of camaraderie and hope. For the first time since their deaths, Marcus smiled back. Tomorrow, he would make the phone calls. Tomorrow, he would take the first steps toward rebuilding his life. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of healing that would allow him to help other veterans find their way home too. But tonight, Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez simply sat in peace, a warrior at rest, finally understanding that strength wasn't about never falling down. It was about getting back up over and over again until you found your way home.